Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. In a world in which so much transcends borders, nothing is more globalized than poverty. Even a society as powerful as America, a magnet to millions of striving immigrants each year, faces its own challenge in helping needy citizens exit poverty to achieve their full potential. Difficult as the task may be, it is an absolute priority, one that serves the immigrant and the native-born citizen alike, and one which should draw upon the American experience and that of other nations. My guest is Mary Dolores Coleman, Associate Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of Political Science at Jackson State University. Mary Dolores Coleman, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much.
I can't imagine a better guest, Mary, to talk about this topic, because you've worked on it in this country and abroad. You worked on it among the native-born and the immigrants. And for that very reason, I want to start with a concept you developed that I find both original and quite provocative in determining, and correct me if I'm wrong, but particularly addressing the state role in how poverty is addressed or not addressed. And that is the concept of public insult. What, Mary Coleman, is a public insult?
I thank you for the question because it really is the crux in some ways of the framework that I'm trying to develop to better appreciate and understand rural poverty in America in particular, but throughout the world more generally. When I looked at the African American experience from 1619, when the first African was brought to the shores that were then, of course, the colony, it occurred to me that what had happened with respect to the African slave trade was itself an insult to the families from which the slaves were captured, an insult itself in terms of the Middle Passage, huge insults over 3.5 centuries thereafter with respect to African American life. As you know, African Americans were brought to these shores principally to provide cheap labor to build the country in places like Mississippi, North Carolina, Virginia, slave labor to build the cotton kingdoms, the tobacco kingdoms, the sugarcane kingdoms. And so if you look closely at American history and ask yourself, okay, why did our country countenance slavery? Why didn't the founding fathers take an opportunity to say no to slavery in the Declaration of Independence? Why did they choose over and over again to exchange the planter aristocracy, their interest, for the sake of these Africans who were brought to these shores involuntarily? So when one looks at the history of African American life, we're looking at the history of a people who were brought to these shores involuntarily, unlike immigrants. And so that involuntary servitude, it seems to me, constitutes 3.5 centuries of public insults. And especially if we ask the question, what might the government have done? What choices might it have made?
Right.
What might people in public office who were accountable for building a democracy, for ensuring a democracy that lived up to its promise, what choices might they have made that would have made it possible for 8 generations of African Americans to have the same opportunities, the same life chances as others coming to this country looking for opportunity?
That's a striking message, Mary. And I take from it that the government's interest over centuries in exploiting cheap labor trumped everything else.
Absolutely. The country, for its part, had also an interest in stabilizing the country. Take, for example, the Civil War. The country clearly understood that after having fought the Civil War, it was in no position to then bargain with the South. So if you take something like the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, where the country said, okay, this is a very tight election, and we're going to decide this election in the favor of Hayes, but we're going to give the South the right to do what it wishes with its former slaves. That decision, while one can understand it in terms of the need of the country to restabilize itself, to reposition itself as a nation after this huge war, unity mattered more at that moment in American history than did the life chances of now sharecroppers.
Mary, we're discussing this in terms of history and in terms of the most dramatic example of exploitation on our shores. And I don't think anyone can dispute that, slavery. Do I take it from you, Mary Coleman, that this public insult as a phenomenon persists in different ways throughout American history? What I'm trying to get is a sense, because I know you address this very globally, and African Americans and many others in our society. Is there a sense you have that public insult as a kind of policy, philosophy, has persisted in our country over decades, centuries perhaps, in the way the poor are treated?
I think so. In public policy, we talk about decisions or outputs or outcomes of public policy decisions. And it's just as useful to talk about non-decisions, the ways in which the government either shows indifference or decides that the stakes are much too high to choose the policy action that might maximize the life chances of the poorest citizens, whether they are in Harare, Zimbabwe, or in Sunflower County, Mississippi.
Right.
And so over time, if we look at what governments have done, at the role of the corporate sector, we see people who are much less keen on maximizing the life chances of the poorest people. And it turns out in many places throughout the world, in Southern Africa, for example, in Southern India, for example, in the Southern United States, for example, that there is this intersection of both man-made insults and natural insults.
Let me jump on that, because, and I like these other countries and societies, most of which you worked in yourself, will bring into the conversation. And I was thinking on this as you spoke. Is, Mary, the conflation of public insult and natural occurrence, natural disaster, such as we've seen in Katrina most recently, is that an example of what you're
It is an example of what I'm talking about. Another example that sort of brings together Southern Africa, Southern India, and the Southern United States is this pandemic of HIV and AIDS.
Right.
And if you look at all of these southern places in these very different parts of the world, you'll start to see some commonalities that unfold. In the first instance, you see people who've had some of the longest history of oppression throughout the world. In the second place, you see these day workers and laborers who are unskilled, largely illiterate, looking for opportunity, leaving their families during the day or the week or the month, going away, having relationships, coming back, minimizing the life chances of their wives who unknowingly are intimate with them. And this intimacy leads to just all sorts of public and private trauma in places in the world where the cultures themselves are not all that transparent. That is to say, people are not quite willing to openly discuss how they might in their individual actions and how governments might in their collective actions work together to minimize the likelihood and spread of HIV and AIDS.
It's absolutely revelatory to me, Mary, and I think to many watching us right now, to hear how these various Souths throughout the world are similar in this phenomena. Which leads me to this question, Mary Coleman. You're obviously a distinguished scholar, an administrator of a university, and you've dealt with poverty issues for quite some time. When or where, I'm just very interested in the origin of your focus on rural poverty as a distinct phenomena, because what you just told us about the American South and other Souths, I think, is quite distinctive from what other people are doing with the subject of poverty.
I am a political scientist, as you've said, and so I read all the literature in sociology on poverty in the United States, and this was around 1987, 1989. I was especially interested in what Bill Wilson, then a sociologist at the University of Chicago, had to say about the declining significance of race and the ways in which our country needed to address the truly disadvantaged. There had been any number of books, including Katz's work on the deserving poor, Larry Mead's work looking at folk who were truly deserving, and so on. So I assembled a conference down in Mississippi around that time, and I brought in most of the scholars whose works were the most provocative and wanted to give them a 2-day opportunity to just walk through and talk about the implications of their work for better understanding rural poverty, because much of that work centered on urban poverty. It occurred to me after those 2 days that while the insights were interesting, they didn't speak to the lived experiences of the rural poor in the Mississippi Delta, for example. So shortly thereafter, I wrote the Ford Foundation. I wrote a proposal to the Ford Foundation and asked for a space of 2 to 3 years to go to the Mississippi Delta to interview families, households, not individuals,
Right.
because in my thinking about poverty in Mississippi and in places that I'd visited throughout the world, what was key to me to understand were the ways in which generations of families either exited poverty, stabilized their exits from poverty, or fell back into poverty. So I wanted to understand the dynamics associated with the pathways out of poverty.
Now, is that, Mary, that very useful background, that contact with the Ford Foundation, the study which resulted, is that in fact the study which I think I read of yours, or at least have examined, of 317 families?
Yes.
Over time
Yes.
in Mississippi?
Yes. I've been in and out of the Mississippi Delta for the last 15 years of my life, but I collected the original family data roughly between 1990 and 1998. So what I have in the work that I am actually writing up at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I have 18 families as the parent generation. These are people husband and wife teams born between 1908 and 1929, just before the start of the Great Depression. I take those 18 families and follow them for 3 generations, which gives me about 317 families. And I'm asking questions about their lived experiences, how they got out of the sharecropping system, for example, how they were able to secure shelter for themselves that wasn't linked to life on the plantation, how when their children were expected to work in the fields to pick the cotton, they were able to send their kids to school at least part of the time, and how given an absence of skills in a place like the Mississippi Delta, they were able to exit or to assist in the exits of their children and their grandchildren.
And my sense, Mary Coleman, of what you found, and again, this is something that I think you've looked at, focused on in Sunflower County, Mississippi, but probably seen elsewhere in the world, is that family agency, the strength of families, the attitude of families, each succeeding generation is a very powerful influence in what exiting poverty means, and you know, this very subject definition of exiting poverty. Tell me about family agency in accomplishing it, and how you measure it. I mean, at what point are you out of poverty?
Yeah, that's a great question. You've asked me 2 really important questions. What do I mean by exits from poverty, and what precisely is familial or family agency? Let me take the easier question first. Family agency consists of the capacity of a mother and or a father and or guardian to pull together a family of children and have those children understand both the moral authority and the legal authority of the mother, father, guardian as legitimate leaders within this household. And I stress authority because over the 3 generations of my study, one clear finding is that both the legal authority to parent and the moral authority to parent both have been in precipitous decline, especially in the African American community, but more generally in American families. So that goes to the question of political agency of families. And I say political agency of families because one of the things I do in my work, I think about the ways in which this country structures its political system. And I see the Constitution as the bedrock of that structure. So the Constitution for me is a living document. So is the family. It's an organism. It's alive. It has rules. It structures opportunity. It tries to socialize children into the values of that family and tries to give them opportunities to exercise their own will. And so in that sense, the family is constitutive. It builds from the foundation of the nation. Even when that nation is scarred, it still builds on that foundation of the nation.
That is a striking point. that the family's values and the family's hopes for success in that sense are directly linked to the constitutional values of embedded within the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And so the state action, to the extent it reinforces its own positive values and aids the family, is helpful. And when it acts as a public insult, it ignores all that.
That's right. To the extent that the nation lives up to its best principles, it allows the family to create legacies of citizenship. This is what I argue in my work. And families that are successful in creating these legacies, one generation to the next, transmitting them in ways not just symbolic, but substantive to children and grandchildren and their children, these families exit poverty. They exit poverty largely because the children have internalized the best of their family's possibilities and the faith in their own government, their own constitution, even when that faith is undeserved.
Right.
So it's this coupling of the internalization of family, of the values of the family, the sacrifices of the parents or the guardian. And I keep stressing are the guardian because the families in my work are not your traditional two-family homes at all points during the children's lives.
Right.
They may start out that way, but a sister whose husband dies might join the family.
Exactly.
Or a brother might join the family, or a neighbor needing assistance might join the family.
Right.
But let me speak briefly to exits, because that really is an important question as well. Obviously, our government has a definition of poverty, a family of four earning X amount of money over time, okay, $34,000 at this moment. What I try to do in my work is say, okay, there is this government standard of poverty, and there is also a government threshold for self-sufficiency. That threshold for self-sufficiency is twice what the poverty level is. So if the poverty level is $17,000, the self-sufficiency level is $34,000. So the question becomes, how does a working parent or two working parents support themselves enough to exit the flat poverty rate? The answer has to be they exit when they become self-sufficient.
Absolutely, and that's the measure you take to define it. Mary, how is this affected by a very international aspect, if you will, of what we've been talking about here, brought home to America, and that's immigration? You've looked at Sunflower County and many other places, and as we both know, immigration to this country and into Sunflower County, into Mississippi and elsewhere, is changing the face of the population. Is it changing the nature of this issue?
It is, absolutely. And that was one of the factors that influenced me to do this work. When I started looking around Mississippi, at the Mississippi Delta in particular, but looking at regions of the state where the poultry industry is really quite dominant, there we could see just an influx of newly arrived immigrants into old neighborhoods.
Largely Latino?
Largely Latino, from all over Latin America, not just the usual places. So much so that the native settlers, so to speak, were not able to keep up with who their new neighbors were, where they were coming from, and how their cultures, their traditional cultures, might intersect or interact with those of their new neighbors. So as I looked around Mississippi, I said to myself, not only do we need to know more about how blacks and whites are faring in terms of their exits from poverty, but we need to ask questions about their new neighbors. How are they doing? So in Sunflower County in particular, according to the census reports there, most of the folks, 60% of the folks there are Black Americans, roughly 37% are white Americans, and the others are Chinese, for the most part, not so much Hispanics. But in Sunflower County, European Jews started coming to this county in the early 1930s, and many of them stayed. And not surprisingly, many of them own businesses on Main Street. And so if you were to go there today, you would see names that would remind you or make you think, for example, that these might be Jewish citizens. So one of the questions I've asked is, okay, even though the numbers are small, how do the pathways that Jewish people actually how did their pathways differ from the pathways of African Americans in this small segregated town? Those pathways differ for poor white Americans because the small farmer class in the Mississippi Delta is a completely different story with respect to their opportunities. It isn't true probably anywhere in the United States that all whites were in the same boat, but certainly in the cotton economy, you had the large plantation owners and the small farmers.
And you think these pathways will differ from, for example, today's Latino?
These pathways will differ, and not only will they differ for different groups, they've differed for each generation.
One thing I want to ask you immediately on this whole question, Mary, is that any hope we have for these pathways or any success in this question, I think, rests upon something else you've touched upon, and this in Romania, Zimbabwe, Angola, South Africa, all the other places you've been to and been working in, and that's the visibility or the invisibility of the poor. And it seems to me that the hopes for success that you've outlined here, government agency that reinforces the family and so forth, depends upon the poor being visible.
I think you're exactly right. And one of the most striking features or patterns that I think I could safely say that I have observed over the last 15 or 16 years, starting first in Eastern Europe with Romania, going there initially in 1989, the Center Roma, or the Gypsies, were everywhere in evidence. I mean, you couldn't walk down the street, you couldn't get to a government building. The masses of poor, hungry, ill-clothed, dirty little children all over the place begging for food and sometimes for shelter. Well, I returned to Romania 4 times between 1989 and 1997. And each successive time, there were fewer and fewer Gypsy children or Roma children visible in the city center because they had been placed in orphanages.
Taken out of view.
Taken out of view so that when Americans or others would visit the country, they would not be visible. But I visited the orphanages because I was very much interested in trying to understand the ways in which we make, through invisibility, governmental indifference toward the poor. And the orphanages, as you might imagine, they were just horrific.
Does gentrification in our society accomplish the same thing?
I would say that gentrification certainly has in certain cities in the United States. As a Mississippi girl, obviously I've spent a lot of time in Chicago and a lot of recent time in Chicago. One of the most remarkable changes in Chicago is that the city is absolutely beautiful, and no poor people can afford to live in the city center. So that poverty has gone outside, to the countryside or to the suburbs. Again, very much invisible. The same thing I think it's fair to say of Washington, D.C.
I think it's very fair to say that.
And I think to some lesser degree, New York City. But definitely, gentrification has had as one of its impacts the removal of the poor from sight.
Hence invisibility, and that invisibility can lead to indifference, to public insult.
It can lead to grave indifference.
Grave indifference to it. Let me reverse the question, Mary. What about a place where, another place you've been, and another place where you've studied poverty, exits from poverty, and integration, et cetera, South Africa, where, as I understand it, Johannesburg's concentrations of the poor and the black poor are so massive you can't ignore them. What about that?
That's exactly right. If I take all of the countries I visited, including its neighbor, Zimbabwe, I would say that South Africa is still very much an outlier with respect to its visibility, the visibility of the poor. You cannot move in South Africa, in Joburg, or anywhere in South Africa without seeing the poor. I suppose it's possible to go to Cape Cod and not see them. But in the main, you see them. They are there. They're in your face. And they're not just poor people, like an individual stream of poor people. There are masses of poor people. They are bare feet. They are hanging their clothes on strings inside the city limits. There are these ghettos. If you can leave one government building or Embassy Row in Joburg, in Johannesburg, and make a left turn, and you would think that you're in a concentration camp where mostly black males between 14 and 25 reside. It's almost as if they understand that they've been marginalized, and the subcultures that they've developed of lawlessness principally really do interfere greatly with the ability of the new government in South Africa to create a system where the rule of law is internalized by citizens. That's one of the great differences, I think, between the South Africa we see today and, say, Mississippi in the 1960s.
Absolutely.
The rule of law was very much in evidence in black communities, even though they were segregated. We internalized the rule of law. But in South Africa, there is a culture of lawlessness that has to be addressed in ways that provide opportunity in order for the rest of the plan to work.
In everything you say, Mary Coleman, I sense passion as much as scholarship.
Yeah.
And a kind of cry, if you will, that in all these Souths, plural, South Africa, South India, the South of the United States, the cry is don't ignore us. And create public agencies that reinforce the family, that help correct the situation while there's still time.
Yeah, in some of these communities, I think the cry is to just hold on, like in South Africa. Young people just really need to hold on. They can look to Angola that had a 27-year-old civil war, and it's really doing so much better than before. They can look to Botswana, you know, a very small landlocked country that's doing very, very well.
Right.
They can't look to Zimbabwe at the moment because there's only horror there. But if they bother to look around, they can create space for faith, for the possibility that things will get better. And the government will have to be really, really interested and involved, engaged in the lives of those young people.
That's an excellent message and full of hope. Mary Coleman, thank you so much.
Thank you
And let me
very
just
much.
leave all of our viewers with what comment that you once wrote, poverty is not necessary. Thank you very much. It's
Thank
not
you.
necessary.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching. Thank you, Mary Coleman.